All right, welcome everybody to our December. This is not December, this is November extension hot topics. Talking about all things poultry. We're gonna throw up the demographics poll here in a minute. Again, thanks everyone for joining us live. Um, Today's topic, poultry, we have our specialist with us, so please feel free to put questions into the chat box. Again, the whole goal of this hot topics is to just get exposure for our campus specialists. So I'm going to quit talking, and I think Matthias, were you going to introduce our speaker? And if you guys can finish that poll, that'd be great. I'll make mention right now, we are ready, or our season 5, which will run the first 6 months of 2025, is ready to roll. So we will have a link for you to sign up for that. That will be good for next season. We'll also put that out in the email that is sent out by Courtney Schmidt. So with that, Matthias, if you want to do an introduction, and then we're going to get going. Okay. Our speaker's with us in person today. It's a great day.
So we are running things a little bit differently. It's kind of odd that we are all in the same room today. But today we are very privileged to have Darrin Karcher with us. He's going to be our state poultry specialist. He's my anything and everything go-to chicken questions. So very, very knowledgeable and does a lot of good things here. So Darrin, we're going to turn it over to you. So.
Thank you very much. So as we go through today, if you have questions that come up, please feel free to just throw them into the chat box as we go, and I'll do my best to monitor that. But as everybody indicated, we're all in the same room, so I'm sure if I miss a question, they'll throw up their hand and let me know, and we'll be able to touch on those. So before we go, just to give you a little bit more background, I've actually been working with poultry since at least the age of 5. My parents own a mail order hatchery, and so small flock was always my passion. Through my degrees, though, I finally earned my credentials for poultry, so people might actually believe what I'm saying, not just from my experience. And now I've been here at Purdue for about 8 years. So today I want to talk all things poultry is what we're going to talk about. And some of this, I think we can tie directly to what you may be doing or to people that you may be talking to. And then I also want to share a little bit about some of the ways that I'll call it pushing the envelope in the poultry world. So first and foremost, this is not uncommon. Well, it probably is from the way that you're seeing it at this moment, but it's not uncommon to walk into your grocery store and you as a consumer are presented with all of these various choices for eggs. The one thing that our poultry industries are excellent at doing is listening to the consumer, understanding that this is what they believe they want, and they will produce the egg for you. Now, unfortunately, there tends to be a disconnect sometimes between what we believe the consumer says they want and actually where they put their dollar when they purchase that product in the store. So if we take these numerous eggs that we have access to, the first question is, let's talk about some of the similarities. What do all of these eggs have in common? Well, okay, let's state the obvious. They're eggs, right? So we know that they're all eggs. We know that they're going to be one of the best available sources of animal protein that we can purchase as a consumer, and that it's relatively cheap compared to some of our other options out there from an animal protein perspective. We know that they're going to have various sizes, and so we can find, smalls, mediums, larges, extra larges, or jumbos in the store. But that may be kind of where you think the similarities stop. But the one thing that we need to keep in mind is that the point of an egg is to produce a baby chick. We just happen to figure out that it's a fantastic protein source for humans. And so every egg, it doesn't matter the way that it's shaped, the way that it may look from the outside, even some of like you can get eggs if you're a small flock producer that feel like sandpaper and it's a texture thing, which is a different nutrition thing that you could talk about. But those eggs all are going to be made up of the same nutrition and provide the same nutrient profile that we would expect to see. Now, there are the occasional eggs that have been modified, and that's what starts to set them off as we talk about these differences. In that bottom left picture, Eggland's Best is probably the most known egg out there when it comes to consumers or by consumers. They can claim, as you can see on the package there, the omega-3 claim, the less saturated fat, the excellent source of vitamins. All of those label claims are in fact proven, and they have to be proven to have those label claims on the carton itself. And so when you start looking at your cartons of eggs that you have available to you, those label claims aren't just there because somebody in marketing said we should promote this. It is because they have to supply documented evidence that those label claims are in fact true. And from the standpoint, when we start talking about the vitamins and omega-3s and nutrient specific things, they have to have a demonstrated impact in the scientific literature on human health. And so there's really some validity when we talk about things like Eggland's Best. When we talk about some of those other differences, we know that we can come up with differences. In the bottom right is just the commodity egg. It doesn't really have anything special about it. But if we look in the upper left corner, we can see that it's cage-free. We can see the pasture raised in the upper right corner. So those are all different types of systems that are used to produce the eggs. The other difference that may show up is the egg color itself. We could have the brown eggs, the white eggs, but you can even now find eggs that are marketed under heritage, where they may have some of the different colors. We can even have eggs that are produced by what some people call the Easter egg chickens, the Americanas or Aracanas, and they're going to lay those pastel colors that you may buy from a local producer, where they're a pink, a blue, and a green, in addition to the browns and whites that we typically see in the grocery store. So the other thing that we tend to do as consumers is we don't just judge those eggs by the outside, but we also judge the quality of those eggs with our eyes on the inside. And if we look at this picture, that yolk on the right has a darker orange color to it than the one on the left. Now, does it mean that it's nutritionally better for you? Not necessarily. But we'll talk a little bit about what does it mean when we look at our eggs like this and we see those differences in the yolk colors that are showing up, and what that why that is occurring and what it could mean potentially for human health. So I want to talk about a research project that we concluded here about 5-6 months ago, where we were looking at egg production, and we were looking at different types of corn that we were feeding to our birds and the impact it was having on that egg product that we were getting. So one of the things that you may be familiar with are carotenoids. These are those naturally occurring things in plants that give it the orange, the red, the yellow, the different colors that we see. So in that picture there, you can see all of the different colors that we can encounter when we're out buying our vegetables or our fruits. And in those instances, those colors are actually different types of carotenoid deposition within those plants that allow those colors to occur and for us to see those. They're all fat soluble. And when we think about what it might mean, some examples beyond just here is we can run into things like marigold petals, paprika, rice, the corn in the picture that I just showed you, algae, carrots. And in those examples, those are all various things that are in fact fed to poultry to help boost the carotenoids that are found within those either egg products or within the carcass itself. For those that may have lived on the East Coast, or if you're watching this at a later point in time or joining from the East Coast, Purdue chicken had traditionally been known as the chicken that when you purchased it, it had a yellow hue to the skin. It wasn't white. And that is because they firmly believed that having that yellow color under the skin was what differentiated their Purdue chicken from any other chicken in the marketplace. And so they went out of their way to purposely feed marigolds and modify the diet with carotenoids so that those birds would deposit that color under their skin, giving that hue or that yellow color to the carcass. So when you were purchasing it in the store, you had a level of confidence in the product that you were buying from Purdue Chicken. So when we talk about our egg, and this is probably a lot more from an egg part than you ever thought existed, because we know the shell, we know the albumin or the egg white, and we know the yolk or that big yellow spot in the center when we break it into our frying pan. But there are a lot more components that make up our egg. But the reason I put it here is I told you in that last slide that carotenoids are fat soluble. And so when we look at our egg, we know that our fat deposition, or where we can find the majority of fat in the egg, is in the yolk. And so that bird, when it consumes a plant or consumes a carotenoid, it's going to extract that color and it's going to deposit it directly into the yolk. And so that is why we get those darker hues in the yolk that we see. In some instances, birds can consume so much carotenoid that when you break it open, you may actually find it distasteful and would not eat the egg because it is too rich in color. And so we can go from one extreme, which is no color, to the complete opposite extreme, where it is very, very colorful or very dark in a color. In case you didn't know why we're here, protein, that's going to be found in the albumin. So when you think about it and you hear people say, if you want a high protein, low fat, you're going to eat the egg white or the albumin and you don't use the yolk, that is absolutely correct. The other interesting tidbit for those of you that are bakers or chefs out there in the world, when you're making your meringues, which is going to be the protein or the albumin, even a drop of yolk of that fat into that egg white, when you're trying to whip the air into that albumin, will cause it to collapse. And so you will not get the same rise that you would get in your meringue that you would have if you didn't have that drop of yolk present. So it's very important to make sure when you're separating your yolk and your albumin that they truly are independent of each other. So why would we want to think about targeting eggs when we're talking about carotenoids? Well, first and foremost, or as I have mentioned at the beginning, right, it's a very nutrient rich, high protein animal source that is available to many groups. Unlike when we talk about pork or we talk about beef, poultry and eggs is something that can be consumed around the world. And it's not very often that you have some sort of a religious tie to it, or you have a population that for some reason, they are not allowed to consume eggs as you might find for different populations when it comes to pork or beef. The other potential thing that this creates for us when we talk eggs is the ability to become a functional food. And what I mean by that is, and Eggland's Best is a great illustration of this, where you can modify the actual nutrients within that food that we then consume as humans, delivering something that we may need. So if we take carotenoids, We know that those are part of the precursors to vitamin A. Vitamin A is going to be important for us as humans. And so, if we can increase the carotenoid precursors for vitamin A in the yolks, we then consume them as humans, we actually can shift the potential for some of our eye diseases that we may encounter as humans because of the increased vitamin A that we now have in our diets. So the orange corn that we're working with a company called Nutrimaize, and they began in 2015. The CEO of the company, Evan Rocheford, is on the left there, and his dad, Torbert, is on the right. Torbert is a geneticist here in agronomy at Purdue University, and he's been working on orange corn for a long time. 2015, then they formed their company. In 2018, you can actually go online and find Professor Torbert's orange corn products and buy orange corn grits and some various things like that. And we have been working with them since 2017 in various capacities to explore then what does it mean as we move into feeding orange corn to laying hens and to poultry, and what that may mean for you as a consumer if it would show up in the marketplace. So, if we go back to this idea that we're making those modifications at the plant level, so we're introducing this orange corn, which we know is higher in carotenoids than the typical field corn that we feed to our animals today. We then are going to feed that orange corn to our animals, or to our birds in this case. That product then is the egg. And so we're going to have those richer yolks, which we know are higher in carotenoids, ultimately then coming to you as a consumer in various egg dishes or ways that you may be using those eggs, and ultimately then having an impact on that human health component. So in this experiment, we took 100 hens per diet of Lohmann Brown laying hens, so 300 hens total, and we fed them 3 different diets. One was just an orange corn. Second was an orange corn with biotin, and biotin is a premix that has various paprika and other things added to boost the nutrient profile of the egg. And then as our comparison, we took just the yellow field corn with the biotin additive as well. We started these birds on these diets at 18 weeks of age, which is when they're going to start coming into egg production. And we ran the project for almost a full year. So we took them through 69 weeks of age. The way that I'm going to show you some data is we look at it as 28-day periods. And if you think about our months of the year, we have 1 month that has 28 days. And so to try to make a even comparison throughout a long period of time, we take that shortest month and then we put all of our time on that 28-day period. Our data that we collected consisted of our yolk colors, egg weights, and egg production. And then we also looked at egg quality traits. And what I mean by egg quality traits are things related to shell breaking strength, looking at vitellin membrane strength. Vitellin membrane is the membrane that is around the yolk. And so the reason that's important is when you go to break your egg into the skillet, the last thing you want to do is break your egg and then have it just run all over the skillet. If you're trying to make sunny side up eggs, or do a poached egg, you want that yolk to be maintained. And so we look at the strength of that membrane and the ability to do that. And there's some other egg quality traits as well. I'm not going to talk about them because we didn't observe any difference in the egg quality traits throughout the course of this 18 to 69 weeks of age. So how do you measure yolk color? There's 2 different ways in which we can measure yolk color. One is called a yolk fan that you can see on the left. And what it has are little fans that go from 1 to 16. And what you do is you break the egg out, you take this fan and you try to match the color of the fan to the color of the yolk. And depending on where that color is, that is the yolk color score that it gets. That is a little more subjective because it's relying on whoever um, the human is that is taking that measurement to be consistent. And if you've got multiple people doing it, they have to consistently call those color scores the same. So the other way that we can do it then is to use what is on the right-hand side, the digital yolk fan. And that little black cup, you place it over the yolk itself so it blocks all the light. And then there is a lens underneath this black part here that actually reads the light or the color of that yolk and gives you an actual number then that corresponds to this yolk fan. So that takes out some of that subjectivity and gives you an actual value that has then been calculated by a computer algorithm instead. So to share a little bit about the results here, when we look at the overall egg production, and I have a few charts and they're going to be set up the same way. This is percentage of production. And what that means is that if I have 100 hens and I get 100 eggs in a day, that means that they are at 100% of their egg production. So you can probably do some math here. And if we're getting 75%, that means that 75 out of the 100 hens laid an egg that day when we collected the data. And then across the bottom here, we will have the period. And remember, that's a 28-day period. So you can think about it that we are talking about once a month. This is where the overall egg production was for the various treatments. And then you can see that we have an orange line if it was the orange corn with no pigment added. So without the biotin, it's that purplish color. And then if it's the yellow, it's that blue color line. What's most important for you to notice here is that when we look at egg production, it didn't matter what type of corn they were being fed. All of the birds seem to produce the same amount of eggs over that time period. And as we were getting here towards the end of lay, so starting at about period 10, 11, we started to see some differentiation between the different diets. And it's not necessarily related to the diets. It could be, but overall, what we see is that as those hens age, they're going to start to drop off on their overall egg production throughout their lifespan. Now, this is an egg weight, and this is looking at case weight. So case weight would be the amount of eggs that are in a case of eggs, which is 360. And so if to put that in dozen terms, that would be 60 dozen eggs, that this is the weight of all those eggs together. And you can see that for all of our diets, that over time they increase in weight, which makes perfect sense because as that hen ages, she's going to produce a bigger egg. And so that's what we're seeing here, that over time, those hens all produced bigger eggs, and it did not matter where, what diet they were on throughout this time period. Now, when we look at yolk color, and this is where things can start to be a little more interesting, we can see that if we had the orange corn with pigment, which is this top line, or just the orange corn itself, they actually always had a darker color yolk compared to the yellow corn that had the pigment present. And so what that's telling us is that even if we wanted to have a darker color yolk, if a producer would just feed an orange corn diet, they can get much darker yolk scores than what they could get by feeding a yellow corn with an additional pigment. So with that paprika or marigold petal being added. Over time, as those birds age, we can see that those yolk colors start to drop, which doesn't surprise us. But you can notice here at period 11, we had a pretty dramatic drop in those color scores, and then we saw it come right back up in period 12. I indicated to you that we can measure yolk color either with a digital means or we can use a color fan and do it by person. And so what actually happened is our digital um, yolk score fan broke for period 11. And so we couldn't collect the data and we had to go back to using individual people to measure those yolk scores. By period 12, we had the equipment replaced and we were right back in. So if you eliminate this period 11 where we had more subjectivity because we had humans doing it, we actually see that these trend lines continue pretty much right in line with what we were seeing prior to that. So to give you an idea of what we were actually seeing for yolk scores, because it's one to see numbers, but to try to help you better visualize what those yolks were looking like when we were looking at them. The yellow corn ranged in color from this 6 to the 11. So that was the color that the yellow corn with a pigment added was looking at. When we look at just the orange corn, we were looking at 8 to 12. So this is the 8 coming over here to 12. And even when we added that pigment, we were still in that exact same range of that 8 to 12. Now, you may be asking what would be typical for what you buy at the grocery store if you just buy a commodity egg. So we're not looking for anything special, no Eggland's Best, no Happy Egg, just the commodity egg. You're probably looking at a score of around a 7, maybe a 6. So that would be pretty standard for what we see. We would typically see right now, as we have concluded harvest, our commodity eggs may have a more strong yellow or be more pigmented because our corn is fresh. But as carotenoids degrade over time, we start to see that these values would start to shift down a little bit for our commodity egg. So what can we conclude from this experiment? Well, first, we know that if we feed orange corn, we can produce a higher yolk color score in general. For it doesn't matter if we have something supplemental there. We know that when we looked at the orange corn with no pigment, they had a lower egg production. But again, I'm not concerned that it was a diet versus just the artifact of increasing age for our laying hens. And then when we look at that period, that was the most prominent effect over our time. Again, as those birds get older, we know that they're going to shift the way that they produce their eggs and what we may be anticipating from them. So the question that I know you're all thinking right now is, what does this mean for me? You have some more education now about what you may be looking at when you buy in the store, but I was told that there's a fair amount of you that may be master gardeners. So what could this mean for you, or what could you do to help someone else that has a small flock? This right here is it. Every time that those birds have that interaction with vegetation. So in this upper left color, right, they're on the pasture, but there's some pumpkins that have been thrown in, right? Every time that those birds pick at that pasture, while they don't get any nutritive value from it that helps them from being able to exist, right? They still need their common diet. That color that comes from the blade of grass, or that color that comes from that pumpkin that they peck at and eat a little bit, all of those colors then will get transferred into that yolk, giving it a richer color. So in all of these other pictures here, these are varying ways that they have impacted or that they have interacted with the different vegetation that allows them then to pull some of that pigment and deposit it into the yolks. So it's a great way, even if it's just when you're trimming your bushes or trimming your trees, cutting your grass, throw those clippings into your birds. It does two things. One, it's going to give them some of that carotenoid, but the other thing is it's called enrichment. And so that gives them something to do because birds explore their environment by hunting and pecking. And so when you give them something that's not typically found in their environment, they're going to hunt and peck through it. So it gives them something to do as well. Okay, so that's a little bit about a research project that we're doing, but now I want to talk about eye exams because we know that ocular health is important for all of us. But my question is, have you ever thought about a chicken and their eye exams? My guess is most of you probably have not, so let's just talk about why this could be important. So we know that when we go, and for those of you that are blessed with not having to have contacts or glasses, you are very fortunate, but this is what it's like when you go. You go to the eye doctor, they give you this Snellen vision chart. They sit you in a chair that's about 10 feet back, and they're going to say, read line 1, and you're going to say CB. And then they're going to go down and they're going to try to find at which point can you not read the letters exactly as they're printed on the chart. That's your visual acuity. Those that have 20/20 vision, you can read all of it. Those of us like myself, I have my contacts in today. I can't get to that bottom line very easily. And so usually that's where I'm going to struggle as I start to read those letters. Well, why would it be surprising to us then that birds may also have to be thinking about visual acuity? And when we think about our wild birds, right, we have hawks that are flying very high up in the sky, or eagles, and they can identify small movements very far away. And then they swoop down and they end up with a snake, a rat, something that they're actually then going to consume. So we know that visual acuity for birds is important. The other thing is we may need to be thinking about color, right? Most of us probably can easily see the three numbers here in these various assessments for color, but those individuals that experience varying forms of color blindness may struggle to know that there's a 45, a 12, and a 5 within these circles. Well, again, what do we think about birds? So as I was going through this, right, and I'm thinking at my last eye exam, they go through, they ask you the visual acuity, they ask you the color potentially. It depends on if you have or had not had that assessment before. But then they do this thing that is somewhat annoying, but it's also kind of funny because they can never count higher than 8. And they'll say, does this look better? And they say, better 1, better 2. And they flip between two things, better 1, better 2. And then you say, oh yeah, better 2. And what they keep doing is modifying the lens until finally you have this clarity or this visual acuity of the picture that you're looking at or whatever it might be. So that got me to thinking, what about our laying hens? Right? We do have birds outdoor access. We also know that we have small flock producers, but in commercial industry, we have also been moving towards cage-free production. And so it may be important for us to recognize if our birds can or can't see something. And so there was this paper published in 2022 where they were using computer modeling to take the picture on the left and iterate what it might look like if a chicken was trying to see that same individual at varying distances. And what they found out is that when you get here to about 0.3 meters, that is the point at which things are still able to differentiate from one chicken to another. And at the same time, we know that there's some other literature out there suggesting that that's also where behavior differences have been observed, is about 0.3 meters away from each other. So as we look at these different environments, we know that we're taking here in the bottom right corner how we had been producing eggs for well over 75 years, and we're starting to move them into these more complex environments. So it could be cage free in the upper two pictures there. It could be with the outdoor access in the bottom center picture, or it could be just strictly pasture raised. And so those birds are in more complex environments. And so are we thinking about or even considering how they may actually see their environment in these different instances? And so I'm working with two collaborators here at Purdue. Esteban Fernandez Urisic is a professor over in biology, and his entire research program is built around bird sight. And then Dr. Greg Fraley, who is in animal science, is a physiologist. And so, working with the two of them, we decided we should start to explore this. Now, it is important to understand that birds see very different than we do when we think about our visible spectrum. Okay, so the top left picture here shows what the human can see. And so this is our wavelengths that we typically can visually see things. And right below it is where the birds can see. And you can see that they, at that 370 nanometer on the far left, they can start to see some within that ultraviolet range, which is not something that we can do. And so they probably can see more colors than we can even understand. And the best that we can do is try to get computers to help us visualize how birds might see their environment. The other thing is to know that birds have different photoreceptors. So they actually have 4 different cones that absorb different colors of light. And then they have this double cone, which actually allows movement or motion. And so not only do they see color, but they can also see movement and motion independent of that color. And the way that this works is that you have light coming this way and it travels through the cone to the point where it hits this visual pigment at the end. And so this is a microscope slide, and we can see the different color pigments here and how they might correspond to those different types of cones found within the eye. And so like this T, which is the UV or the very short wavelengths, correspond to this one here that is a little more white, as opposed to the long wavelength, which is the R and a red color. And then we have the P, which is that one that allows motion. And you can see that it is kind of that uh, opaque color, a little bit of bluish tinge to it. And so when we look at it, the way to think about how a bird sees is we have visual pigments, we have oil droplets, and when we add them together, that is what allows the bird to see their environment. And so I talked about previously these carotenoids. What we don't know is these oil droplets also have composition that pulls in carotenoids. And so if we change the carotenoids in the bird's diet, does it actually change the oil droplets in the eye, which could impact then the way that they visualize their environment? We have no idea, but it is such a great question or an interesting thing to think about. And so when the birds put all this together, that's what allows them to have their color discrimination. So we're going to talk a little bit about laying hen eyes. So hopefully you're not squeamish about eyes. If so, just kind of tune me out here for just a few minutes. But what we found when we started to look at white birds and brown birds is, and this is the actual research data that we generated, we can see that they have similar curves here for their ocular media transmittance. And what I mean by that is the fluid that fills their eyes just like we have ocular media, it's the fluid that fills our eyes. So it's very similar for brown and white birds, but you can see that over time, so this is 17 weeks of age, and as we shift it, we can see that as birds get older, their ocular media transmittance change. And so what that means is that as light enters their eye early in life, compared to that same light entering their eye later in life, that it may be shifting the way that those wavelengths are actually going into the eye because of this ocular media. And then when we look here, you can see that this is the average of both strains because the brown and the white birds were very similar for that ocular media. And again, it just helps to demonstrate that it changes over time as those birds get older. Now, when we look at the relative densities of the different photoreceptors, we can see here that brown birds and white birds have different photoreceptors, but they're pretty consistent through time. And so that's important to understand that those photoreceptors that the birds have early in life, those same amount of photoreceptors in their eyes are going to be there at the end of life, but that brown birds and white birds actually have different densities of those photoreceptors. Now, this is where this starts to get more interesting as you put this all together. When we look at how brown birds visualize pigments, you can see these four peaks in the curves, but you can see for white birds, there's a shift in that blue and the white. That is interesting. You have no idea how excited we all were to figure that out. And it's a difference of 20 nanometers right here. We pulled it out on the right side. What that means is that when we think about brown birds and white birds for laying hens in our different environments, that there's a lot of things that might be able to be explained not just from a behavior standpoint, but by the fact that the brown birds may not be able to see things in their environment the exact same way. So when we look then at the sensitivities over time, again, we can see that there's a difference between these brown birds and these white birds, and we see a very similar response for wavelengths as we get out to that 600 nanometer. They kind of all come together. And so what this does is just reinforce the fact that we have a difference between brown birds and white birds, and that it's going to change over time as they get older. So I know that was really science deep, but here's what this means. This is called an ecological avian perception model. And so as it says ecological, it's used a lot in ecology. The idea or the way that this works is that if we take into consideration the way the eyes are built for the bird that we're looking at, we understand the densities of the different photoreceptors in their eyes. We look at whatever the ambient light is. So it could be the sun outside, or if you're in this room, conference room that we're in, it would be the light coming from the light fixtures. We can look at the reflectance of whichever object we're looking at in the background. And so this would be the light and how it reflects off, let's say, the background here. So this wall compared to the light and the reflectance of the bird. And when you put it all together, we can start to visualize or understand if a bird could in fact see or not see something. So I told you that it's very complex for birds and that they see more things than we might see. So you need to think about birds seeing in two different ways. One is color. And so in the left here, we can see this yellow circle compared to the red background. But as we shift it from a high contrast to a low contrast, when we get to the far right, you can't tell that there's a yellow circle in that background. So birds can see that color contrast, but they can then also see achromatically. So without color, this is those double cones where they can see the movement. So you can see here the black circle inside the gray background. But as we move here to the far right, we get to a point where we can't tell that difference. So birds can see in both ways, color and in brightness or achromatically. So to help you think about how I'm talking about this, if you look at these four pictures, depending on the light, you can see the texture of the bricks change. So if you look at the blue, you can see down here that this is pretty prevalent right here for some texture. But if we look at this red, it washes it out. You can see that there's still some texture, but not near as much texture as the blue light. If you look at the word or a glow, you can make out the letters okay with the red, but when we get it under the green, you can clearly see all of the letters. So these are some of those contrasting things that, depending on the light source, changes how we may or may not be able to see something. So that's pretty much what we're thinking about with our birds. So what does it mean to put it into practice? Everything I've been talking about. If you look at this picture that you see right now, we can all pick out some things that are very obvious, right? There is a bright yellow tank sitting on a blue structure. We can see a dirty white floor. We can see a very white bird. And if we look through that pop hole, we can see the green grass or the green pasture in the background. But how do birds see it? So if I take this picture, this is a picture that we took in our research room. You can see dirty brown litter, or a brown litter because it's used, and you can see a brown egg. That's what we see as humans. Now, if we look at it from a chromatic contrast, and so this is for the birds looking at it from a color perspective. This dark line at the 4, it's called just discernible units, which means that birds can actually see it if it is above a 4, and if it's below a 4, they cannot see it. And then we have the object, which is the egg, versus the background. So in this case, if we take a brown egg and we put it against a concrete bare floor, these are different brown birds, white birds. So don't get hung up on if it's a brown or white bird, but these are different color lights for the different color bars. If we use a green LED light, birds cannot tell that there is a brown egg against a concrete floor. With every other color, they can see it, that there is a color difference between them. Now, if we take that same egg and we put it on that brown used litter floor, we can see it doesn't matter what color of light we use, birds cannot see that brown egg from the brown floor. So that is color. Now, if we go in the achromatic, which is that brightness, we can see that the only time that they can see the egg compared to the bare floor is if they have a red LED light. If we take it and we look over here for the egg versus the used floor, again, only with the red LED light does it allow the brightness of that egg to be seen against the background of the floor. So when we take that first picture I showed of the pasture chickens, we can take all of those different things in their environment and do this comparison to see if they can actually see the difference in both the color or in the brightness aspect of their vision. Now, if you watch this right here, you can see that these birds are expressing what we would call an unexpected behavior. But hopefully you can also see that right here in this picture, there's a shadow. What we don't know is perhaps what we are calling an unexpected behavior is because those birds, as they visualize their environment, actually see it as a ledge that they can jump up onto. And so those couple of birds are actually taking that chance or trying to get onto a ledge that may, in their minds, exists, but the reality is it's a shadow and it doesn't exist. And so I think that there's a lot of things in our production environments, both within controlled housing like we might use in commercial industry, as well as within the pasture aspects of commercial industry, or even small flock, that if we better understood how they see their environment, we can start to modify or change things to help them better see, or to get them to stop using or stop expressing behaviors that we don't want to see. So while I don't believe that we'll ever get to the point of using the eye chart and administering that to all of our birds, I do think that research like this will allow us to really start to change how we think about designing our environments for our birds, as well as the types of things that we may want to give to our birds to enrich their environments or to express or not express certain behaviors. So the other thing, and this is more of a teaser, we are venturing into the realm of pasture hens. And so this picture on this slide is actually one of the mobile units that we purchased here at Purdue. And right now we have some birds on pasture, and we're just trying to figure out what it's going to be like to have birds in this unit. And starting next year, we'll actually jump into some various research questions. But I just wanted to share some pictures with you. So you already saw this one a little bit. That's what the inside of the coop looks like. And so we have their nesting areas over here. This is their feeder. This is their water over here, perches, slatted flooring, and then pop holes on both ends so the birds can come and go. The picture on the left is when we first put those birds out on pasture. It's a wide open pasture. There isn't shelter. And so you can see during this day when it was extremely bright out, all of those birds were underneath the unit itself, trying to make sure to either find shade or to not be so visible to whatever predators may be around where we've set up this pasture unit. What some interesting observations that we've made so far. This is the pasture as we've been pulling the unit through the pasture. You can see that some of the grass has been trampled down. The one thing that the farm manager made the comment, you got to be real careful when you walk now because there's potholes everywhere. The birds have been aggressively digging into the soil, using it as areas for dust bathing and expressing those behaviors. And so there are lots of holes now throughout our little area that we've had pastured in. You can see here that in the bottom left picture, they use that unit for shade, as well as when there's something interesting, you get this clustering of birds to go investigate whatever it is that the sisters in the flock may have discovered. And then that picture on the right here, just kind of a general usage of the pasture. The thing to notice on this picture compared to the prior one is it's more of a cloudy day. And so the one thing that we've observed and commercial industry has also observed is that when it's a cloudy day, birds tend to use the pasture or go outdoors more than when it's extremely bright. And I think, again, that plays into that ability of how they can visualize their environment as well as any potential predator threats when the sun isn't quite as bright as it would be. So that's why they prefer to have those cloudy days. And with that, I'll take any questions that you might have, or if there's a topic that I didn't touch on and you just have an interesting question, feel free to throw it into the chat and I'll gladly answer that question for you.
All right. Well, thanks, Darrin, for the. Yeah, I forgot we were in the same room here. So, thanks, Darrin, for that talk here. So, yeah, go ahead and throw your comments in the chat here or questions in the chat, and we will go ahead and let Darrin take a crack at them here. So, Darrin, I guess I do have one here for you. What's the reason you got into poultry?
So the biggest reason I got into poultry is I grew up with it. So I always had the aspirations of going to college. My first degree is actually in ag education. Did my student teaching, thought I would become an ag teacher and go back and take over my parents' business. And when an opportunity presented itself, I went and did a master's in poultry genetics and just have never looked back. But I really love working with birds and working with people that are in the chicken business, right? And it doesn't matter if it's a 4-H kid or an adult that's been doing it for lots of time, um, because the reality is they're passionate about it. And that's what makes it exciting, is to work with people and help them figure out how to make it work even better if they're struggling with things, or just to talk chicken sometimes. That can be pretty fun and exciting.
So, what was one unexpected thing that you saw in the research on the how well chickens can see? What was the unexpected thing?
So I think that the unexpected thing that we picked up was the fact that the brown birds and white birds see differently. Um, we know that there are behavioral differences between them, but there was nothing that had ever been documented in the literature to suggest that they actually see different. Part of that is we know that within bird species in general, working with Esteban, there are very different um, eye characteristics to various bird species. But we made, I guess, an assumption that a chicken is a chicken, even though it may have a different background. So, because we see the differences between the browns and the whites, I would venture to guess that if we started to look at like silkies, some of the other fancy breeds that are out there, even their eyes might be slightly different from each other, suggesting that, a chicken is not just a chicken. They really are all very unique in how they have been put together.
So, when you say brown chicken and white chicken, it's just a general white chicken and a general brown chicken. You're not necessarily breed specific or anything like that, are you?
Yeah, so for this experiment, the white chicken and brown chicken are breed specific from the standpoint of same genetics from a genetics company. What that means for the average small flock or backyard person, when you purchase your birds from, or your chicks from, a hatchery or from a local producer, unless it is something that is specified as a specific breed type, they may have what they call, whatever their hatchery trade name is for the brown laying hen. The reality is that brown laying hen is probably one of 2 or 3 types of genetics that are out there. And so, at least from our perspective, we feel pretty comfortable that even though we only looked at these 2 genetic strains, that if we would extrapolate that to the other genetic strains that are all brown birds or all white birds, that we would see this same trend within those brown and white genetic strains across the board.
Okay. Well, thanks for that. So yeah, in the chat here, I did put a couple links to a couple things here. So the first is our post survey. We just want to collect some data from you guys and some feedback from you about how we did today and some of the things that we could improve upon, or even some ideas for in the future as well. The second one is we're running out of time for this season's Hot Topics, and we would like you to register again for next year or next season here, starting in January. So we've got a pretty good lineup. I don't have that list right in front of me right now, but I know it's going to be just as fascinating as some of the stuff that we talked about today. So with that, and if nobody has any other questions, thanks for joining today.